Welcome to today's webinar brought to you by the International Institute of Rural Reconstruction and Give to Asia with support from the Humanitarian Leadership Academy. So my name is Louis Aguila, learning lead of the Humanitarian Leadership Academy Philippines. To start this webinar, I'll provide an orientation of the platform so you all know how to use it and to interact with us. You should see several buttons on your screen depending on the type of the device you're connecting with. So these buttons will likely be in the top left-hand corner of your screen or on the bottom of your screen. So the first button you should see is your audio settings. This is where you can adjust your settings if you're not able to hear me very well, or if you want to connect a new piece of hardware such as a pair of headphones. So next to this is the chat button, which is the function that you can use to introduce yourself to the panelists. You can tell us your name and your organization, and perhaps if you'd also like to share a little bit about your experiences on this topic and what you hope to learn today, for example. Next to that button is the raise hand button, which we won't be using today. So if you have any questions, please just feel free to post them straight away to the Q&A without feeling the need to raise your hand first. And lastly, we have the Q&A button. So this is the main functionality that you will be using to interact with us in this webinar. Please post any questions that you have. Feel free to do so throughout the webinar's presentations and discussions. So my colleagues and I will be online and responding to all those that we can as they come through in writing, and we'll also post the other questions directly to our panel of speakers during the dedicated Q&A session, which will be held towards the end of the webinar. Please note that if we do run out of time and if we aren't able to answer any of your questions, we will do so after the webinar alongside a recorded version of this webinar, which you can rewatch or share with your colleagues or within your networks for those who couldn't make it today. So that's about it for the platform introduction. I'll hand over the floor to Wilson Barbon of IRR.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our third webinar. This webinar is part of the series of webinars we are organizing for as part of our program called the Non-Government Organization Disaster Preparedness Program. It's a partnership project between IRR and Give to Asia, which seeks to build the capacities of a network of community-based organizations in 7 to 8 countries in Asia. And this webinar is part of that providing capacity development assistance to these CBOs. Now, one of the key themes that surfaced during our initial discussions with this network of CBOs in Asia is the topic of resource mobilization, fundraising, and sustainability. But unfortunately, it is one of the key challenges in working with CBOs in Southeast Asia is the level of investment going into CBOs are not that is not that great, and this has resulted to challenges in terms of how do these CBOs sustain themselves in continuing their good work on disaster preparedness in their respective communities. And we all know, we all value the huge potential and role of community-based organizations in not only in disaster response, like organizing disaster relief and recovery, but more so in facilitating community-based disaster preparedness initiatives at the community level. They make do with less resources. They are always in the front line working with local people. So it is this value of community-based organizations that makes them good, where we should be putting more investments. So for this webinar, we'll be talking about what are some of the good practices and challenges. So we will deep dive into this discussion about fundraising and how CBOs engage with their donors, with their partners, and organizations, to make use efficiently limited resources for disaster preparedness programs. For the objectives of this webinar, we'll be looking at current and global trends in terms of challenges and how do we mobilize investments. We will learn a little about modalities and avenues to generate and mobilize resources for community disaster preparedness programs. It's not always, writing proposals and getting money from donors, but we will look at different ways that we can mobilize resources for our disaster preparedness programs. And then finally, we will listen at our speakers, more of sharing effective strategies and practices in terms of strengthening our engagement with current and potential donors for disaster preparedness programs. So for this webinar, we have two resource speakers. So the first one is Dr. John R. Batten. So he is our senior advisor here for international outreach at the International Institute of Rural Reconstruction here in Silang, Philippines. So John has more than 30 years experience working in Africa, and he just recently returned to the Philippines, where he's currently working as our senior advisor for international outreach. So John started his career in development work with IRR many years back, and this is like his homecoming to the Institute. So John will share to us his vast experience and exposure in terms of capacity development, funding, and working with international organizations. Our second resource speaker is Mr. Birger Stamperdal. So he is the CEO and president of Give to Asia, our partner organization. So Birger has been a part of Give to Asia team for quite a number of years now, and he has an extensive experience in working with non-profit as well as for-profit organizations, mobilizing resources, providing technical assistance, and serving donors and clients, as well as different community-based organizations here in Asia. So our first speaker, John Batten, his career has always been with people-centered development. He is the former CEO of ActionAid, based in London. He served as Director General for AMREF, that's the African Medical Research Foundation in Kenya, and has served as like a consultant for many organizations, including the Poverty Eradication Network and several CSOs in Africa and Asia. So, John, based on your experience, how important are CBOs? This overall conversation about fundraising, and why is that when we talk about generating and investments in community preparedness programs, why is it important for CBOs to be part of that? And maybe you can share about what are your experiences and insight into this topic of CBOs and fundraising. John?
Thank you very much, Wilson, for that introduction. And good day to you all on this webinar. This is my pleasure to join a second webinar with the collaborative project between Give to Asia and IIRR. And it's my pleasure to have an opportunity to share with you some of my experience. It's interesting that we should be talking today about fundraising for DPP when the news in the Philippines is the terrible tragedy going on in Japan at the moment, where the country is inundated with terrible floods, and our thoughts and prayers go out to the people who are suffering there. It makes you reflect even more on some of the countries in Southeast Asia where you're all working, and whether in fact we're as prepared as Japan, and we know we're not. And if we were to be suffering the same level of rains, I think it really serves to motivate us all to try harder and work faster to enable more vulnerable communities to be prepared. So today, fundraising. We do a lot of capacity building for CBOs, but quite often fundraising is an area that we ignore at our peril, because sooner or later, every CBO wishes to be able to sustain itself. And no matter how you were funded, whether you had a benefactor or whether you evolved slowly, unless you happen to have a lifetime benefactor, which few of us have, sooner or later you're going to need to engage in fundraising. And for many, this is a great challenge. CBOs, when they start in life, are often people rich and cash poor. By that, I mean that a lot of energy and commitment by dedicated people go into starting CBOs. And quite often the concern is the core business that you have, your disaster preparedness or DRR or development initiatives more broadly. And quite often we are not experts in raising funds and income for our organizations. So for many CBOs, I think this is an area of threat and potential weakness to our long-term survival. Of course, when we go to donors, they're looking for CBOs that are strong and that can sustain themselves. And sustainability is something that we should best plan for from the very outset of starting our organizations, not to begin stressing about fundraising when we're already financially challenged. So financial sustainability, what exactly is that? Well, it requires, I would suggest, diversified sources of income. If you rely obviously on a single donor, that's a very risky proposition. And I would argue that if you rely even on one type of donor source, that's also risky, because families of donors tend to be strong and weak at the same time. And if you are invested in one family of donors, quite often what one does or what one is able to do is replicated with others in that same family of donors. So diversified sources of income. The second thing I would suggest in financial sustainability is having an established funding reserve. Again, few CBOs have bank accounts with money sitting in it unused. But to have and to work at establishing a reserve over time is really quite important when you have gaps in income flows, which many of us experience on a fairly regular basis. The third aspect of financial sustainability, I think, is organizational strength itself. And I'll return to that a little bit later. Now, why CBOs in the field of disaster preparedness? Why are they preferred partners? And why is there now so much concern that we enable CBOs to become stronger and more sustainable? Well, of course, as we all witness, the frequency and seriousness of disasters seems to be increasing with climate change and increasing droughts, increasing floods, increasing storms, etc., etc. This seems to be almost a global phenomenon, but of course it's the vulnerable communities that suffer the most. Although, as we can see, even those communities that have already established a high level of preparedness are still vulnerable. So it's all a matter of degree. So it's the poorest communities that need to strengthen their preparedness the most. And sustainable local CBOs are the most effective agents in ensuring that communities are most prepared and continue to work on their preparedness on an ongoing basis. CBOs themselves are more cost effective and more efficient than other types of organizations, particularly those not based in the community. CBOs have local knowledge, of course, and normally they have the trust of local people. Certainly if they are surviving and sustainable, they have the trust of local people. CBOs can mobilize immediately. They are part of the community. They can also become integral parts of the local government infrastructure and recognized as assets at the community level, both for participating in disaster preparedness and response, but also in sharing local government resources that are quite often a donor to local CBOs and not to other kinds of organizations. CBOs, before they really enter into fundraising seriously, need to reflect on, I think, themselves and how strong they are as an organization, how well they are managed, and particularly how well they manage their funds. However good your fundraising marketing may be, if the organization you're generating income for is perceived to be weak, or perceived to be inefficient at managing funds, no matter how good your marketing is, you're unlikely to have a very positive result. So CBO management is really quite a critical aspect, and its leadership. Community members desire their CBOs, of course, to be successful, to be able to sustain themselves and to grow. And it's in everyone's interest that this actually happens. So CBOs must demonstrate their ability to manage themselves well and safeguard the resources and oversee the resources that they have entrusted to them. Yes, and I think this, of course, for all the hard work many organizations do in building up their reputations and their strength and their transparency, years of hard work can be wasted overnight when there's misuse of resources and corruption, which has bedeviled, of course, so many organizations. Although I should say that this is less true, I think, of CBOs, because they are so much in the limelight with their community members. You're very accountable when you're right on the spot with the people that you are both helping and raising funds for. The next slide, please. So before you begin fundraising seriously, what then are some of the factors that you need to consider in terms of organizational readiness? The first, of course, is your organization should be conducting activities which I've called here fit for purpose. What does that mean? Well, people are going to give money to organizations that are actually addressing real needs or real priorities or real issues in the community. There are organizations who work in areas of development which are really quite difficult to raise money for. They're not as popular as others. I think if you're focusing on disaster preparedness, that's a very immediate and important issue for communities. So it should stand to reason that what you're doing is appreciated by the community, and therefore your fundraising is more likely to succeed. I would also say that a part of organizational readiness is to be able to demonstrate that you have the capacity to survive as an organization. People will be reticent to invest resources in an organization that may be not around next month or next quarter or next year. So organizational strength in terms of your board or your governance or your management or your continuity of staff, having systems in place which you use. These are all a part of demonstrating to the public at large and potential donors that you have the capacity to survive. Having a strong set of values and principles that are where you stick to, having credible leadership, having had a successful number of projects at the community level, implemented, benefiting the community. These are all a part of building your credibility for when you try to raise funds at a local level and even beyond the community itself. As we've mentioned, funds need to be well managed. You need to be open and transparent. And I think that goes without saying. Moving on. So fundraising itself then, where do CBOs actually generate their resources from? I talked earlier about the importance of diversifying your income sources if you're going to be sustainable. Well, here are 5 areas that I've summarized of different families of donors, if you like, or families of income that you generate. And these are true for the large multinational NGO as they are for the local CBO. But of course, within each of these categories, you would be addressing and targeting different potential donors. The first and biggest source of income for local CBOs are individuals. Not necessarily high net worth individuals. CBOs raise money from middle income people and even from people in the community themselves with a relatively low level of income. Community participation, both in terms of local gifts and giving time and wisdom to projects, lowers the cost of projects. And quite often poor people themselves can give even a modest amount to local causes. The extent to which they do that, of course, helps in raising money from people outside the community with a middle income or even high net worth individuals. Self-generated income is the next group of income. Many local CBOs have projects through which they can generate income, and maybe technical capacity and personnel who can also generate income from services they provide to others. This type of income is very critical because it is unearmarked money. It's money which can be used for a wide number of purposes. Then you have the corporate and business sector, local businesses, local corporations who often want to promote their community engagement and their social enterprise by providing gifts in kind or funding to local CBOs. Then, of course, perhaps further away from communities, but often very interested in helping CBOs are a wide range of institutions, international NGOs, faith-based organizations, foundations, trusts, and research partners, academic institutions that like to work with communities at a local level. All of these are open to receive proposals for partnership at the local level in return for achieving their own goals and objectives. And finally, we've got the official donors. All too often, we tend to talk about donors as though they are official donors, that is bilateral and multilateral donors. Here in Asia, of course, we have many generous official donors from Japan, China, Australia, Korea. USAID, of course, has long been a big donor to some of the countries in Southeast Asia. The EU, particularly some Northern European countries, and of course the various UN agencies. These donors, of course, are quite demanding professionally in terms of how you succeed in generating income from them. The rewards can be high, but quite often you have to raise your organizational capacity significantly to qualify for those. So just finishing, I think, with some key lessons learned from my experience with CBOs. I think to be successful, you need to live within your means. That is, be very careful that when you do have a time of sufficient sources of funding, that you don't live to the full extent of what that funding allows. There have been many cases where CBOs or local NGOs gear up for high levels of funding, which they then can't sustain from local sources in the long term. So do be careful as you change your culture and gear up your capacity, that you don't get to a level where you can't sustain that level of funding over the long term. Organizational capacity is something that every organization from day one needs to continually invest in. The stronger your organization becomes, the stronger your programs become, the stronger your staff become, and the better positioned you are to successfully generate more funds. And the last slide, please. Networking, of course, is critical. Building up your networks of contacts and friends, which you can call on in the longer term after current funding is over. Networking is a continual issue. Keep a good database, make sure it's current. Interact with your networks. It's become much easier in this day and age with the internet. And most importantly, never forget your core donors, your original donors, or the donors that have supported you over a long period of time. The most important donors you have are the ones you currently have. do make sure you communicate with them well, that you treat them well, that you meet their expectations. These are the ones who've been supporting you from the beginning, and you need to build on them, not find yourself going to new donors and then finding your old ones dropping out. So I think that's all I have time for. Lots of red flags are flashing here. So I'll hand back to Wilson and look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you. Thank you so much, John, for those like valuable insights into this topic. And I think in your own view, you talk about fundraising as not much about the availability of resources and about donors. You talk more about, it's more about strengthening capacities of CBOs to demonstrate effective work, good leadership, and transparent and a more accountable management. Because as you mentioned, donors would not fund CBOs that they're not sure whether they will continue to exist 6 months down the line or 1 year down. So it's very important. I think my key takeaway in your points are that, for CBOs to be really effective in fundraising is, it needs to be very proactive, and very strategic in terms of including their fundraising goals into their long-term planning and operations. And I think that's a different way of discussing this topic, where we usually, discuss fundraising as just the role of donors and how much money is available, but CBOs needs a lot of some housekeeping task needs to be done for us to be fundable. And you also mentioned about the emerging trends in terms of the increasing role of individuals and corporate donors and local and international. And our next speaker from our partner Give to Asia, I think is the person who will share more insights into this topic. Speaker is Burger Stamperdahl. He's the president and CEO. Good morning, Burger. And Burger has worked with a number of tech companies in the Silicon Valley, for marketing and programs. And so he has both experience in terms of profit and non-profit business management and marketing. And he has been in leadership with Give to Asia for a number of years now, assisting local nonprofits, strengthening donor relations. And I think Burger into this webinar is valuable in providing insight in terms of, because Give to Asia is mostly engaged in donors in the US. So Burger, in your view, what are some of the trends now with regards to, say, disaster preparedness funding in the US? And how do you think CBO should respond to these trends and to these opportunities that are emerging in the US? Burger?
Sure. Thank you, Wilson. Very happy to be here today. It's very it's good to see so many people on the webinar, and this has been a great partnership between Give to Asia and IIRR. Maybe what I should do is start quickly by describing a little bit about what Give to Asia does, so that just to give some context of the feedback I'm going to give a little bit later on. So we're a little bit different as an organization. We are really a philanthropic service organization in a way. We've been doing this work for about 17 years, working with corporations, individuals, and families, and some private foundations during their efforts to support local communities in the Asia Pacific region. So we're working right now in 25 different countries across the region, and we're fundraising primarily in the United States and Hong Kong, although we also have some donors in other parts of the world. So that's a big part of what we do, is working with those donors to help build the relationships with them and community-based organizations and other in-country organizations in the Asia Pacific region. One of the big parts of what we do is that we have local people in all of the locations where we work. We think that's a really important part of the work that we do, because we're able to work in the local language and have more of a face-to-face relationship with organizations like yours, and work with you not just in trying to make the connections with donors, but also through the grant process. And let me talk a little bit about the way we work with donors in particular. So the way that we work with donors is we identify what they're looking to fund, and we try to find a match with organizations in the countries and in the communities that they care about. And some of that work is done via research that we carry out. And then once that happens, we act as a sort of steward and project manager for the projects that are being funded by those donors, those corporations, or by those families, or by those individuals. And we also do quite a bit of work with corporations in supporting their CSR teams that are oftentimes based in country and are local to you, and doing things like volunteering or donating their own money that is then being matched by the company. We also do quite a bit of work directly with Asia-based nonprofits. So as some of you may think of us as a grant-making organization and funding specific projects, we also have fiscal sponsorship relationships with about 275 organizations in the Asia-Pacific region that use our registration in the US and Hong Kong to fundraise and to be able to give their supporters in those countries a tax deduction for their support to you in your communities. We also try to provide greater visibility for those organizations that are part of our network, and opportunistically market and try to sell specific projects that our CBO and grantee partners come to us with. And again, all of this is done in language, and we are able to also provide some capacity building in language and program support for specific donor projects. So with this particular project and the partnership that we have with IIRR, we've been partnered with IIRR since 2014 to help build what we call a community of practice of locally led disaster preparedness programs and CBOs that are doing that work. One of our roles has been to try to find effective ways to tap more international philanthropy for CBOs engaged in disaster preparedness. And again, the primary targets for that are corporations, families and individuals, and some larger private foundations. So let me share with you some of the takeaways that we've had over the last 4 years and what we've learned about trying to go after that kind of donor or those kinds of gifts for CBO disaster preparedness programs. I'm going to do this by donor type, because the donors are very different depending on who they are and sort of where they sit and what their priorities are. So for corporations, typically we've found that they don't identify themselves as disaster preparedness donors. It's not a theme that many corporations, at least not in our network, have identified as a primary target. They're far more driven to actually give in the aftermath of disaster, which is a little frustrating, because it means that the funding cycles are very uneven. There's a lot of giving that happens right after a disaster. Some of that giving does go to disaster preparedness, but there isn't a consistent stream. What we found instead is that there are a lot of corporate donors who are giving to themes that might fall more in line with resilience programs, so livelihood diversification, infrastructure, health services, and other kinds of activities that might be part of an overall resilience program, and in some cases disaster preparedness. The actual dollar amount that families and individuals give is much larger than corporations. And so while oftentimes that might mean building more strong personal relationships with larger individual donors, you can also crowdfund and tap philanthropy from individuals and families in different ways. And finally, private foundations, a handful we've found are very focused right now on trying to fund at the local level. Many of the larger foundations tend to work with larger INGOs to do that kind of work, but they are looking at ways to shift the model that they consider to be more of a top-down funding model traditionally, and looking for ways to give more of the decision-making power to local leadership. So how do you engage with with these three different kinds of donors. So I'll provide some advice that hopefully is helpful as you're thinking about ways that your organization might tap into those kinds of donor sources. For corporations, I would say, think about who is in your country, who may even be in your community, and how can you get in front of their employees, the local employees of larger international companies, as well as companies that are domestic to you, have a great deal of influence, probably more influence than you realize, in helping to identify local CSR and philanthropy partners. The other piece is to really understand what the company funds, so that you understand how your programs might fit in. You're going to have much more success in your initial conversation with a company or with employees if you know already what the alignment of your programs are with what that company funds. And then make yourself visible. In your country, there are events that bring together companies for their CSR and philanthropy programs. Look and see how you can build visibility near you with some of the companies near you. And post-disaster, again, is unfortunately the best time to make an ask. Families. I would say that families are often word of mouth. If you have already individual donors who you're working with, try to find out how they can be an ambassador to you and spread the word. If they care enough to give to you, they can also perhaps be tapped to bring in more donors to support your programs. Fiscal sponsorship, as I mentioned before, which Give to Asia does, can help provide some visibility to you outside of your geographic area. And then getting people to visit you and see your work is probably one of the best ways to build really loyal donors. And then I guess the final piece I'd say with families, but perhaps with all donors, is to be as transparent as possible. Trust, we find, is one of the major barriers for someone to give a gift. And so understanding that in order to build trust, you have to be transparent and responsive to the kinds of questions that donors ask. It's going to help you be successful more quickly, more often. And then finally, with the private foundations, again, as I mentioned before, we find that the larger international foundations typically seek international NGO partners to work even at the local level. And so you may want to identify an INGO who you can partner with, who understands you, understands what your priorities are, understands how you work and how you could be best served, and they might be able to also get you in front of some of those larger private foundations. Just a couple of more slides here on engaging. So next, I'd like to talk a little bit about engaging online. This may seem obvious, but in our experience, we've worked with many local nonprofit organizations in various countries that are maybe not doing some of the basics to help build visibility for themselves. Do you have a website? And can people make online donations on that site? Is there a simple message that is a clear call to action? Sometimes what we see on websites is a lot of information showing lots of different things going on, and sometimes it's hard for the donor to understand what the organization's really doing. So as much as you can simplify and really hit home the core of what your organization does and why somebody should give online, I think the more you're going to convert some of those visitors to your site into donors. Social media can help. We find that we're primarily working on Facebook and Twitter, quite frankly. We find that Facebook is very good for building followers, and we are seeing an increasing number of donors coming from that platform. We also see that the more serious, larger donors are seeking advice and trends and seeing what's happening on Twitter, where some other conversations are happening. Regardless of what you're doing with your marketing, images tell stories and attract far more attention on social media, and videos even more. If you have the ability to tell stories with images and tell stories with videos for your social media, it's going to reap bigger returns. But in the end, it's about getting the introduction to the donor who may give a significant amount. And so most major donors will want a direct in-person connection, or at least a phone discussion before committing funds. So be prepared that you'll need to have that relationship with donors, and make them in a way partners for you. Our advice for community-led programs is that you first, before you do anything else, should engage with your community to understand what your own needs are, and don't lose sight of your own community while you go after the dollars. We've seen in the past that some organizations do what the larger donors will want them to do, as opposed to really focusing on what the community needs. But what we found is that donors actually want more and more the community-based organizations to be experts that understand what's really needed in their community, and it's okay to have an opinion on what really is needed and what should be funded. And again, be transparent and network, build those relationships. I'm going to quickly touch on general donor engagement advice. Understand what motivates them. Again, as I mentioned with corporations, understand what they give to, but also understand what information they want, and how to steward them so that they will come back again and again. Keep regular and open communication with your supporters. As Dr. Batten said, stewarding your existing donors and building trust there is probably the most important thing you can do. Personalize your communication, take time to personally thank and inform each donor, and share stories of impact, but also share impact numbers. And then my last slide is just some general advice for launching a campaign. A strong cause or a program that responds to community need and is described really clearly and has a clear call to action is a great campaign, especially if it can scale and can take various sizes of donations that still give each donor a sense that they are contributing a meaningful piece to the program. We do run some partnership campaigns where somebody who makes a $100 gift, for example, is giving a very clear segment and definable segment of the project, whether it be supporting education for one person or funding a one week of school, and set a specific amount when you make the ask, rather than keeping it general. Hopefully some of those pieces of advice have been helpful. I'm looking forward to answering questions during the Q&A. I'm sure there's probably much more to say, but I'll stop there. Thank you again.
Okay, thank you, Berger, for do you have for those very practical suggestions and tips about engaging donors and providing us some perspective in terms of the U.S.-based sources of funding for disaster preparedness. And I think you've shared a key, some important points on practical things of what CBOs can do. So one really important is about visibility. I think that is something that CBOs can also make within their organization, like online and doing some social media work, more visibility in terms of and videos, attending local events, because not all donors are just looking at outside their country, but within their country are the opportunities as well for corporate and individual donors. And you also mentioned about the importance of winning and sustaining trust with donors, and I think that will be sustained with more engagement with them, with our donors. CBOs need to engage with donors more effectively, more regularly, to build and strengthen that trust. And finally, in your last slides about CBOs, I think just like similar to what Dr. Batten mentioned, that the huge fundraising asset for a CBO is their quality of their work in their communities, their sustained engagement with the people that they are serving. Unless that is like clear, sustained, and communicated very well, CBOs will not be able to strides in terms of securing funding to sustain their programs. So thank you again, Dr. Batten, for sharing your insights, and Berger also. So now it's a time for our question and answers. Actually, I have two questions. And now there are three questions being raised. So I will start with question number one. It was raised earlier, I think during the time when Dr. Batten was discussing. This is about a country like us. If we talk about fundraising, there should be an NGO. There is a huge role for INGOs, international NGOs, to come between the donor and the CBO. So, what are your thoughts about how can we change this trend from CBOs directly accessing funding to a donor? I mean, what are some of the tips, your insight, this huge role that INGOs plays in making that connection? Maybe John or Berger can respond to that question. Okay, John?
Yeah. I think the observation that, my observation really is that for CBOs and small local NGOs, I would say it's true. It's much more difficult to access the larger intergovernmental, bilateral, multilateral donors. It's difficult because sometimes the size of the projects that you're looking at are rather small for the amount of investment you need to make in establishing a proposal and a relationship with a large bilateral donor or multilateral donor, which is why the practice, if you're focusing on official donors, the practice is really to go through some intermediary institution, and the international NGOs tend to be the one of choice. They are easier to build a relationship with. They are able to work at smaller levels. They have staff that are closer to the community, so they do make a good go-between. But I think for disaster preparedness work, and I saw another question that implied also that even if you're in touch with such large bilateral donors, disaster preparedness tends not to be a priority focus of many of them. They tend to be looking either in other sectors or subsectors, or more broadly at the long-term development process. So I think what was implicit in some of my remarks earlier is that I would urge smaller local organizations to really look at the resource base you've got closer to home, to look at other kinds of donors that would appreciate the importance of building capacity in disaster preparedness. One I think that we've not discussed much is the local government. Now, I know in some countries that might not be a very helpful suggestion because the relationship may not be good between local government and CBOs. But I think in other countries, disaster preparedness is getting a lot of attention from government, and funds from central to local government are being allocated, and they are available for access to local community efforts. So I think in those countries where the relationships between the non-profit sector and local governance is stronger, we should not leave them out of the equation. So I think my advice is to look at local corporations, to look at local individual fundraising, to see whether there aren't areas where you can generate your own income, to avoid this dependence, if you like, on going to the bigger aid agencies and therefore going through intermediaries who themselves are actually struggling to maintain their own funding diversification. So I think as your work is local, think local with fundraising and move outward from success locally to success with donors who are further afield. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you, John. Just breezing through the questions that are being raised. So I think the questions about the role of INGOs and the role of intermediaries in terms of generating resources for CBOs. And then one question is being raised here is about, is what sort, maybe Berger can provide some insight into this discussion. Like, is there like a current advocacy, at the level of among donors, whether there is a move to changing this reality of of creating more mechanisms that make funding more accessible for CBOs and not just for INGOs. So, Berger.
Sure. Yeah. So what I mentioned earlier in my presentation, that there is a trend with some private foundations looking at how can we shift the model to be more focused on and looking at what's happening at the local level, and allowing CBOs and local nonprofits to play more of a decision-making role in the way funding comes from international sources. I think there is a I think a swing towards funding locally driven programs right now, and that those conversations are happening with some of the larger private foundations. There was also I think the United Nations, and I'm forgetting the name of the decision, but there was an attempt to currently only about 1% of international funding goes to local organizations, and they're trying to shift that so that 20% from various donor sources will go to local organizations. That's a huge aggressive stance to take, and it's causing the private philanthropy community to look and see how it can contribute. Going back to the earlier question that Dr. Batten answered, I would say that one of the challenges with reaching that goal with private philanthropy is not just CBO's difficulty in reaching donors, but also the donors' difficulty in reaching the local organizations, knowing who to trust, being able to get a tax deduction, which for many donors in the US is a huge motivation. There's in many of those situations, they are looking for a partner, perhaps an international NGO or a US-based organization that helps them find those local organizations that they want to fund. I think maybe the more important part of that equation is the CBO's ability to then build a direct relationship with the donor, regardless of how the funds flow, because that's really the relationship you want to have, is with the donor, not with the intermediary.
Yep, thank you. Yep, thank you, Berger. I think you mentioned about earlier, in the previous conversation we had about this great bargain that they referred to, shifting the priorities of from 1% to 20%, but that's a huge ask. That's a huge target, based on the current pace of change in terms of making funds available for CBOs. But it's an ongoing discussion, which is a good thing. It's a conversation that is happening, that was not happening 4 years ago when we were starting this NGO disaster preparedness program. Yeah. So next question, I think there's another question here that would has been already responded to by your responses, Dr. Batten. It's about entry point. How do we gain access to this funding? And unfortunately, right now, it's through networks and through our contacts in INGOs and whoever our partners in these donor countries. So we look at a different question now. There's another question about what's the current feel for donor funding in terms of disaster preparedness. Berger mentioned earlier that most of the funding goes to reactive humanitarian response, but not so much on preparedness activities. Is there like, what are some of the opportunities that, you can think of that we can, while this is happening, we can still include disaster preparedness initiatives within those current funding streams on disaster response? So, yep.
I do think that there are family and individual and private private foundations that are focused on the area of disaster preparedness. I think it's a harder sell to corporations, but there are donors who are looking at disaster preparedness in the context of climate change, or in the context of the specific country areas that they're interested in. And also, as I mentioned earlier, I think that there are donors who will fund disaster preparedness in the context of a larger community resilience program. If they have an interest in the community for whatever reason, they have a vested interest in supporting preparedness. But I do think that from our perspective, corporations have been the hardest nut to crack. And I would like to go back also to something Dr. Batten said, which I think is a really key point, is that really, I think for some of these some of these programs, looking domestically as opposed to internationally for your funding sources is going to be the best long-term play, because the donors local to you are going to be the most committed, maybe. So.
Yeah, I think we still have like a number of questions being raised by our participants, but unfortunately we are running out of time, so we need to wrap this up. But I assure all the participants that we will respond to all these questions either through mail, and it will be recorded into this webinar discussion that we will upload in our Community of Practice website. So just to wrap up, like what we have discussed and learned, in terms of our objectives, in terms of what are the trends. So one of the trends, we are now looking at different donor sources, not just from big, bilateral and institutional donors and grants, but we're now looking at the role of individual donors, individual giving and philanthropies. In terms of modalities, we have now graduated from just writing proposals and accessing grants. Now we have opportunities online for crowdfunding, reaching and tapping most of this individual giving and mobilizing volunteers to support our disaster preparedness programs. And then in terms of our practical way forward, like after this webinar, what can the CBOs do, to improve and strengthen fundraising? First is about thinking seriously about long-term sustainability of the CBOs. Think about fundraising as an element for your organizational health. And then secondly, think about visibility, like how can the CBOs will be more visible online, attending meetings and events locally that would help the visibilities for our CBOs. And then finally, we need to set up some mechanisms and practices within CBOs of sustaining our engagement with our current donors, in strengthening that relationships, maintaining that trust by giving them updates and communication regularly. So those are the key takeaways that we have talk about in this webinar. So I would like to invite you also to continue our conversation. We have a discussion forum in our website, in our Community of Practice website. The link is flashed on your screen. And then we also have, for if you want more courses on fundraising, you can also visit the Humanitarian Leadership Academy, the online learning platform. The link is there, kayaconnect.org. They provide a number of online courses for CBOs, on this topic on fundraising. And then the webinar, once we have made it available, we will upload this in our Community of Practice website, www.dppasia.net. So you will find the recording of this webinar and even the previous webinars that we have conducted in the past. So on that note, thank you very much, Berger and John, for taking time to meet us. And Berger, I know it's late there in your side of the world, but thank you for taking time to talk to us here in Asia. And until the next webinar. So thank you, IRRR, Give to Asia, HLA for for facilitating this webinar.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.